Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. It's easy to forget more than a year into his costly invasion of Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin had some staunch allies amongst Europe's political elite. Berlusconi in Italy, Schröder in Germany come to mind. So too does my guest today, Karin Kneissl, the former Austrian foreign minister who famously danced with Putin at her own wedding in 2018. Now she lives in exile, forced out of Austria, she says, by death threats. What does her story say about Vienna's close ties to Moscow and the impact of Austria's neutrality? Karin Kneissl in northern Lebanon, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much for your invitation, Mr. Sackur.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I think we have to start with this question about your location. You were a senior member of the Austrian diplomatic political elite until recently. Now you've left your home country and you're in exile in Lebanon. Just explain to me why.
Well, when our government literally imploded in 2019, all I wanted was to continue my academic work and publishing. But I had to find out that there was not a single contract. Furthermore, a lot of harassment, also the death threats. But the bigger problem, honestly, was this de facto prohibition to work. So I decided to quit. And first I went to France, and now I'm in Lebanon, and I cherish the freedom of mind here in Lebanon.
At the root of it all, I think you would agree, are questions about your attitude toward and your relationship with the Putin regime in Moscow. So let's get to that immediately. When you came into office as foreign minister, how would you describe your attitude toward Vladimir Putin?
Well, when I came into office in December 2017, my determination was to conduct a neutral foreign policy, and there were three big chapters I wanted to start. One was reopening our relations with Turkey, which had been suffering a lot. I wanted to bring more geopolitics into our foreign policy, like opening up a China desk, which we hadn't had at that time. And as a neutral country, starting a strategic dialogue both with the Russian Federation and the United States of America. The dialogue with Russia, we called it a Sochi dialogue, and the dialogue with the United States was the Salzburg dialogue. So these were the three bigger chapters I started with.
Yeah, I think what's very striking to me is that you were nominated to be foreign minister by the far-right FPO Freedom Party in Austria, and they signed a cooperation agreement with Putin's ruling party, United Russia. And the party leader, the Freedom Party leader, said that he opposed economic sanctions against Russia, which many of them had been brought in after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Now, he wanted you to be foreign minister, so presumably you were deeply sympathetic to those particular policy positions, were you?
Not necessarily, because many in the FPÖ actually disapproved of my rather independent work, such as looking for a rapprochement with Ankara. And when it comes to Russia, this was one topic among others.
No, but let's not get stuck on Turkey. I want to talk to you about Russia. Did you oppose, at that time, after the invasion of parts of East Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, did you oppose the intensifying EU sanctions against Putin?
What we did and what had been started prior to my nomination was an economic and civil society dialogue within the framework of the sanctions. So the sanctions of July 2014 by the European Union were in force. But within the framework of those sanctions, and we worked only within that framework, we started to conduct a civil society dialogue, and just like Germany did with the St. Petersburg dialogue, or France with the Trianon dialogue.
Right.
So,
see, I guess what I'm getting to is mood music and tone as well as specifics. For example, in 2018, and this is soon after the British government and other European governments have no doubt that Putin ordered the poisoning of a former KGB agent in the United Kingdom by the name of Sergei Skripal. After that, you, Austria's foreign minister, chose to invite, presumably your good friend Vladimir Putin, to your own wedding. Why did you do that? Why did you think that was wise?
Well, I had informed a number of political dignitaries about the wedding, among them members of the Austrian government. And I had also handed an invitation to President Putin when he was on a state visit to Vienna upon the invitation of the Austrian president in June 2018. To my big surprise, he accepted the invitation. So that's how it started.
And how many other leaders did you invite to the wedding?
Well, I'm not going to enumerate now. The invitation was really a coincidence in the context of the visit during an exhibition we opened. But if you want to know, I also asked Jeremy Hunt whether he would like to attend, but he was it coincided with his summer vacation in Sicily.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy Hunt wasn't the Prime Minister. Vladimir Putin was the President of Russia at a time when EU countries were imposing new sanctions because of the fallout from the Skripal poisoning. You then not only invited him, you chose to dance a waltz with him, you gave him a deep curtsy, and you showed him perhaps as much respect as any person could possibly show to a Russian president. You were hammered in the Austrian press for doing it. In retrospect, now we're, 4 or 5 years away from it. Do you think that was terribly unwise of you?
No, it was not unwise, and I'm not going to start now this mea culpa story that I'd been asked beforehand in several other interviews. So, no, I don't regret that I asked President Putin for a waltz, and he made a bow. And in response to that, I did what a lady does when she has danced with a gentleman. I made my reverence.
Would you dance with him today?
Yes.
A man who's indicted by the International Criminal Court suspected of war crimes.
Yes, what has the one with the other thing to do?
Well, I must say I'm a little bit surprised that a suspected war criminal would be welcome at your wedding, were you to be having one, and you would be looking forward to dancing with him.
Well, about the war crimes, you see, I mean, I would, for instance, like to see Julian Assange, who has compiled a number of documents about war criminals, and some of them may be also related to high-ranking British circles. But I'm not going now to enter into this whole war criminal indictments, because we have plenty of war criminals on our within high-ranking political circles.
So just to get to the point, I suppose, the basic blunt point, today, with everything that has happened over the last 15 months in Ukraine, you still regard Vladimir Putin as a friend whom you'd like to see at a social occasion?
I am very careful with the notion of friend, because a friend is somebody whom you call at 4 o'clock in the morning because your car is broken, for instance. And I have met President Putin at several occasions. Last time I met him was in May 2019 on the occasion of the signing of the Sochi dialogue. And I accompanied the Austrian president. And just as a little reminder, the Austrian president then invited President Putin to join him for the Salzburg Festival in 2020. So everybody was very much excited in 2019, 2020 to have President Putin be at the Salzburg Festival, Gazprom paying the whole thing. Let us also recall the overall context of 2019 and 2020.
See, there are many people inside Austria who now look at the very close ties, which you perhaps symbolize more than anybody else, the very close ties between the political elite in Vienna and Putin's regime in Moscow, and they have grave concerns that it led to major strategic mistakes inside the Austrian government. I'm just going to quote to you one foreign policy spokeswoman for the Green Party, Eva Ernst-Gigic, who said Putin's fifth column in Austria wanted to turn the foreign ministry, that is your ministry, into a kind of Russian matryoshka doll. Were you, in essence, working for the Russians?
No, I was not working for the Russians, and Mrs. Cicic and some of the Austrian press have insinuated a number of things which should better be decided at court. Actually, the person you just quoted has also been accusing me of running espionage networks. So there are all kinds of accusations in the room which should be decided at court. No, I am not working for a Russian spy network.
Well, you chose to raise the issue of espionage. I just want to ask you, just because I'm very interested in the background, the evolution of your thinking. There is a former KGB agent, Sergei Chernov, who worked for the KGB until the early 1990s. He was later poisoned and he left Russia, and I believe he made a home in France. He says that he attended the elite Paris school, the ENA, at the same time as you. He said, quote, "I had a lot of contact with Karin. She was my classmate. She was pro-Putin long before she became foreign minister. And I got the impression, and I wrote this on her intelligence card, that she could be a good candidate to be recruited by our services." That's a former KGB agent. Did the KGB ever formally approach you?
No, nobody ever from any Russian embassy has formally approached me, in contrast to some Western countries who were very eager to approach me.
No, I don't mean formally. Did they approach you in any way?
No, I was never approached, neither formally nor informally. And this person, Mr. Sergei Chernov, whom you just quoted, let us also get here into a chronological order, because there's a little bit of disorder. We attended the École Nationale d'Administration in Paris in 1992. That was the year when the Soviet Union was breaking apart, when the KGB actually was closing down. And Mr. Chernov has been running from one media TV talk in France to the next, making these claims that he had recommended me for the KGB, which in 1992 was just about to close down. And Mr. Putin, as far as I know, also left the KGB in 1992. So how could I have been a Putin fan, or whatever you just quoted him, when in 1992 there was no Mr. Putin?
No, to be fair, he didn't mention Putin. He just said that you were, he did mention Putin, but he also said that he thought you, given your mindset, your attitude toward Russia, would be somebody that the KGB might be interested in. But I'm prepared. You say you've never been approached.
There was no Russia. But Mr. Sackur, in 1992, there was no Russia. There was a Soviet Union. And Mr. Chernov has made these claims in order to get attention, in order to be in TV shows. I never had any contact with him apart from the fact that we attended the same academy, and he was there recruited as an active KGB agent.
You've explained your connection with Chernov. Thank you very much. You have other connections, of course, in Russia, not least the fact that for more than a year you served on the board of the state-owned energy giant Rosneft. Why did it take you 3 months after Putin's all-out assault on Ukraine in February of 2022, why did it take you 3 more months to decide to resign from that board?
Well, BP is still a shareholder in Rosneft. It's there with 24 billion, I think. It has never notified its exit. So I'm not the person who quits when there is a turbulence on the ship, and that's why I stayed. But BP is still there.
You didn't feel uncomfortable sitting on the board of Rosneft as Russian forces were invading Ukraine?
No, I did not feel uncomfortable. And I think that BP and many others don't feel uncomfortable, just like Qatar Investment Authority, and there are many other shareholders. But BP, British Petroleum, Beyond Petroleum, whatever you might call it, is still a shareholder of Rosneft.
I guess the reason you've just told me you didn't feel uncomfortable, you were happy presumably to stay on the board. So I guess we can only conclude the reason you quit the board in the end is because the European Parliament passed a resolution demanding that the EU Council impose sanctions on you for your place in the Russian economy. Is that what forced you to resign?
The legal reasoning was one on the Russian side that around the 20th or 15th of May last year, all EU passport holders had to quit the company. So that was a different story. And I quit it, yes, I think it was on the 25th of May when all EU passport holders, whether they were on the board or in the executive, could not anymore remain.
Right. So what I'm getting to is that there's no point of principle for you here. So let's just talk about some principles. Is it for you a clear principle that Russia, in that invasion of Ukraine beginning February 2022, has committed an egregious violation of international law?
Anytime a war breaks out is a failure of diplomacy. And
that's not my question. My question is very simple.
Yeah. So what? Can you please repeat your question? Because I just wanted to...
Does Russia's all-out brutal invasion of Ukraine from February 2022 represent an egregious violation of international law, in your opinion?
Any kind of outbreak of law is a violation of international law. Yes. And I have said that before.
I'm asking you whether the Russian invasion is, in your view, entirely illegal.
Like any outbreak of war is a violation of international law. Yes, that I just replied.
And would you like to see, going back to our earlier conversation, Vladimir Putin before the International Criminal Court in The Hague? The UN has presented, through its Independent International Commission of Inquiry, overwhelming evidence of a whole series of suspected Russian war crimes. In particular, he's charged with responsibility for the deportation of thousands of children to Russia. But the evidence goes much further. Do you want to see him in The Hague?
No, I don't want to see him in The Hague. But again, as I just said beforehand, for instance, I would like to see Julian Assange free. That would be, for instance, something I would like to see.
I just wonder why you're so unwilling to answer these direct questions. Julian Assange is an interesting subject, but it's not for this. Do you think there is a case to be made that Vladimir Putin is responsible for war crimes?
Well, first of all, let me respond as a legal scholar. I'm not really a lawyer, but I studied law, and I have dedicated a lot of my work in the legal office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also to the creation of the International Crime Court. I was involved in that in the 1990s. And one of my first actions as minister was to increase our tiny contribution to the ICC. So I'm somebody who has always been in favor of pursuing international crimes. But let me just remind you that a number of states have not signed and ratified the Rome Statute, the founding charter for the ICC. So it has no jurisdiction for President Putin. And this is my formalistic response as a legal scholar.
It is interesting that Austria is formally diplomatically neutral. You, of course, as foreign minister, represented that neutrality, but I think it's fair to say you're clearly not neutral anymore. You make regular contributions to the state-run Russia Today media network, which, of course, is controlled ultimately by the Kremlin. You make many visits to Moscow, and you are constantly criticizing European leaders for their sending of weapons to Ukraine. So you've taken a side, haven't you?
Yes, I have taken a side on many other issues, and I refrained from commenting Austrian foreign or domestic policy for a number of years. Whenever I was asked, I said I'm not commenting on Austria. But unfortunately, as a country whose neutrality is not only a matter of national legislation of 1955, but also guaranteed by a number of international acts, Austria is not anymore neutral, neither politically nor militarily.
What do you mean by that? I mean, Austria is certainly not sending weapons to Ukraine, as are, of course, so many other European nations, but Austria, like Hungary, refuses to do so.
Yes, Hungary, being a NATO member, also gives no authorization to the transit of weapons across its territory, while in Austria we have around 5 transits per day, and recently a number of Italian weapons reached Ukraine, and they were destined for Poland. So there is the list is long, but I would have liked to see a different, real neutral stance when it comes to also to these military aspects. Also, let me recall that the European Union is now buying ammunition from a common fund called the European Peace Facility. So any EU country is bound by that. And of course, you can also discuss that ever since Austria joined the European Union in 1995.
I mean, as you know, there are many Austrian strategists and political thinkers who think that Austria should be doing much more to help Ukraine and should abandon this notion of formal neutrality. But let's not get stuck on that. Let's talk about a different lesson that might be learned from what's happened over the last 14 months. I've just come back from Germany, where the Zeitenwende, the turning point that Olaf Scholz recognized with the Ukraine invasion, means Germany has weaned itself off, effectively weaned itself off Russian energy. Austria, in December of this winter, used 70% Russian gas. Isn't it dangerous and irresponsible for Austria still to be so dependent on Moscow's energy supply?
Well, as somebody who has been teaching oil and gas issues for about 20 years, I always said diversity lies in liberty and liberty alone, which actually is a quotation from Winston Churchill, who was also interested in oil and gas issues 100 years ago. But we have seen Austrian importing Russian gas ever since 1968. By the way, OMV
and you think that reliance should continue, do you?
Well, you see, it's not up to me to give any advice to the utilities companies. The decision-making process is one of the utilities companies, OMV, plus some stakeholders from the government. I have always said one should diversify. This has always been my attitude.
A final thought, if I may, Ms. Kneissl. You write plenty about diplomacy, and when it comes to Ukraine, you say all weapon supplies to Ukraine should stop. There should be immediate dialogue, should be immediate peace talks. That's the only path out of this crisis. You tell me, how exactly you think this crisis can end if there is no more arms supply to Ukraine? They can't force Russian forces off their territory. Vladimir Putin has annexed huge chunks of Ukraine into Russia. How do you believe that that can be the basis for negotiation and for peace?
Well, I do hope that the Chinese mediation will make some start. There are several points. One of them is territorial integrity for Ukraine. Another point is sanction lifting. It's also mentioning ceasefire, so stopping of more arms delivery. And we had a recent phone conversation between President Zelensky and Xi Jinping. So maybe Russian diplomacy can start with some sort of breakthrough, but it should happen, first of all, on a technical level. We won't see some noble word like peace being applied and happen in the immediate, but I do hope that a ceasefire can be implemented. It can only save lives, and I think every soldier, every civilian who is killed from whichever side is one life too much that has been destroyed. This is my attitude, not only as a diplomat, but as a human being.
All right. Well, Karin Kneissl in Lebanon, I thank you very much for joining me on Hard Talk. Thank you.
You're most welcome.